Just briefly, you think about the Secret Service and the fact that they protect the president, and many of you are familiar with what they do, but you begin to wonder, well, why is the Secret Service involved in a safe school initiative? And we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about what the characteristics are very briefly about targeted violence. We're going to talk about what the findings were of this safe school initiatives and the implications, and then just talk briefly about using threat assessment as a tool to identify people who are of interest. And then we'll talk just briefly about some of the important initiatives that schools are taking at different places throughout the country. Many of you are probably familiar or heard about the incident in Littleton, Colorado in 1999. That's an incident where there was a shooting by two people in a high school. Both of them were students. They killed 12 students that day. They killed one teacher, and they wounded a lot of other people. And their intention that day was to kill as many as 500 people in that school and to blow up the school. That was their intention. As a result of that incident, the Department of Education approached the Secret Service, and they said, listen, we understand that on a daily basis you do threat assessments of people who have untoward interest to people that you protect, and you do threat assessments based on that. Is there somehow that you can take your procedures, the way you do things, and apply it to a school settings? Can you look at students? Can you help us look at students the way you look at potential assassins against the president? And after some discussion, we thought clearly that there was enough synergy there that we could do that. And we took some of our best psychologists and psychiatrists and put them together with the Department of Education. And they came up with a great strategy to try to determine a couple questions, the answer to a couple questions. Can we identify behaviors? Are there knowable things that we can identify prior to an attack? And if we can identify certain behaviors or certain things, then can we prevent that attack from taking place in the first place? So what Secret Service did in coordination with the Department of Education, I think this is an important point for those of you that are in government now, because there probably are other things that your agencies can do that perhaps you're not thinking about today. This is a great example. Who would ever have thought that Secret Service was going to get involved in preventing school violence? But those of you that are involved in government, and in some cases other areas, might think about not just school safety, but how there are other sort of collateral responsibilities that you might be able to assume to help other departments within your various governments. But there were 37 different incidents that Secret Service and Department of Education looked at, 37 different shootings throughout the country. And it went back a ways. It went back probably about 20 years. And these are cases where almost 3/4 of the incidents, the attacker killed one or more students. This is what was found, this is going back to 1974. More than half of the attacks occurred during the school day. Almost all the attackers were current students while they carried out their attack. All of the targeted school violence examined in the Safe School Initiative were committed by boys or men. In most of the incidents, the attackers carried out the attack alone. From time to time, that's not the case, but in most of these it was. Just in general, these are the main categories of findings from the Safe School Initiative: characterizing the attack, conceptualizing it, signaling it, advancing it, and resolve it. And we'll talk just briefly about each one of those. In terms of characterizing the attack, it was really found that there was no useful profile. I mean, I just said a minute ago that most of them were men or boys, but still there was no really useful profile where every single person fit into the same exact categories. But many of them felt bullied, many of them felt persecuted or injured by others prior to the attack. Interesting note here, mental health disorder did not appear to be prevalent among attackers. Now we'll find that's a little bit different in the Virginia Tech attack. Most of them demonstrated some interest in violence, be it through movies or books or those sorts of things. But most of them had no history of prior violent behavior, and most of them were known to have difficulty coping with losses or personal failures. Conceptualizing the attack. Now this is on the part of the attacker, thinking about the attack itself. most of the time, they're rarely sudden, impulsive attacks. In other words, most of the time, these are planned ahead of time. And this is an important point because as we're looking for these behaviors, you know, as these assessment teams are formed and they're talking to students and administrators and others, there are signs that are part of the planning process. Signaling the attack. Prior to the incident, most people knew about the attacker's idea or planned attack. This was one of the most significant findings from this, that other people knew about the attack. Now, in many cases, they were told about it, maybe by the attacker himself, or hurt himself in most cases, but they didn't take the person seriously. So somebody said, you know what, I'm going to come to school tomorrow, I'm going to bring a gun, I'm going to kill some people. If he told some of his friends, or even in some cases if he told a teacher, the teacher didn't take it seriously. And so this was one of the most important points, that if somebody makes these threats and somebody says something that obviously is kind of out of the ordinary, there needs to be action taken. In most cases, the attackers did not threaten their targets directly. Most attackers engaged in some behavior prior to the incident that caused other concern or need for help. So again, there are these behaviors out there that can be identified. Advancing the attack. In some cases, other students were involved. Now, maybe it was knowingly, maybe it was unknowingly. In other words, if some of their friends are helping them buy a gun or find a gun, maybe the friends don't know that the attack is going to take place, but they nonetheless are helping him. And most of them had access to or had used weapons in the past. Resolving the attack. Despite prompt law enforcement responses, most attacks were stopped by means other than law enforcement intervention. And what happens more often than not, either other students or administrators, or in many cases suicide, are the means of stopping and resolving the attack. I think it's important to note that what was done with this information is that the Secret Service, again, in coordination with the Department of Education, went out and taught these training curriculums at various levels, various communities throughout the country in the United States. And what we found in several cases, anecdotally, is that there were a number of times where individuals were identified just because of this training that was given. In other words, the orientation toward setting up threat assessment teams, you know, putting together administrators, teachers, students in some cases, RAs, resident assistants who live in the dormitories, law enforcement in some cases, and helping various communities throughout the country to identify people who might be a threat to others. We know anecdotally that the police ended up in some cases, specifically there was a case up in New England where the police, shortly after a seminar that was conducted, went out and ended up arresting an individual who had a number of guns, and they thought, and they told us, that had the intent to harm tens, if not hundreds of people. So, you know, one incident, preventing one incident doesn't sound like a really big deal, but Virginia Tech, for instance, you know, had that been prevented, and none of my presentation here this morning is a criticism in any way of what happened at Virginia Tech. It was obviously a tragedy, and certainly everybody tries to learn ways to improve and to be better prepared for the next incident. But I think it's important because we keep talking about prevention and we keep talking about trying to know about these things ahead of time. And if we do know, then what can we do to prevent these things from happening? Let me just kind of switch here for a moment because these seminars that I talked about are continuing to be given around the country. And after 9/11, as you might imagine, the U.S. looked at everything that it did in terms of security. And one of them included the campus public safety. And so it was looked at in terms of, are we really doing everything that we need to do to protect children and administrators and professors on campuses throughout this country? And just briefly in summary, the 3 points of focus that they looked at was overcoming fragmentation. And what we mean by that is working better with other organizations. Oftentimes you'll have kind of stovepipes, both within schools and within communities. And to the extent that you can reduce that fragmentation and work in a more cooperative fashion. Creating a national agenda. And that's something that's a fluid process that continues certainly throughout today, and I'll talk in a minute about some activities that the President directed to be done. And also establishing a center for, a National Center for Campus Safety, and those are projects that are certainly ongoing. The recommendations that they made really fall into some of the things I just talked about. Collaboration, obviously operating a safe campus, that goes without saying, but both from a prevention and a response perspective, and strengthening operations and administrative functions. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about Virginia Tech. Everybody's at least heard of the tragedy there last April. This is Sang-Ho Cho. He was 23 years old, killed 32 people, wounded 17 more, and then killed himself. This is a picture of videotape that he took himself and then delivered to NBC News up in New York City during the shooting itself, and I'll go into details about that in a minute. You can see some of the response here. Let me talk just briefly about the campus itself. Virginia Tech is obviously in the state of Virginia. It's out in Blacksburg, which is on the extreme west coast of Virginia. The campus is about 2,600 acres. It's what people consider an open campus. In other words, there's no fence around it. There's no demarcation. People can come and go, and they do all the time. That day on the 16th of April, there were about 36,000 people, theoretically as many as 36,000 people on the campus. That included about 27,000 students. Probably about 9,000 of them lived in campus housing, and others, employees, et cetera. The police department at Virginia Tech is a professional campus police department. It's an accredited campus police department. About 35 full-time members. My understanding is that on April 16th there were about 5 officers on duty during that shift of duty. And then there's another police department, the Blacksburg Police Department, which obviously the university sits in the middle of Blacksburg, and they have mutual aid programs to support one another. Cho had pretty much of a troubled life. He was born in Seoul, South Korea, and although he did fairly well in school, I think he graduated from high school with a 3.5 GPA, he had trouble adapting to his surroundings, and oftentimes he would be withdrawn. And he was referred on a number of occasions to mental health professionals. But nonetheless, he continued to work his way up. He moved to the U.S. I believe he was 8 years old when he moved to the U.S. Ironically, he went to a high school that is just a couple miles from where I live, and his parents, I don't know if they still live there or not, but his home was right in Centerville, Virginia, which is just a couple miles from where Jack and I are. This was an event that touched us all, being nearby in the community. So in any event, he had some issues, and even when he got to Virginia Tech, his parents really didn't want him to go to a large university, but nonetheless, he went. They went to see him every weekend because they knew that he might have trouble kind of assimilating into a large place like Virginia Tech. He started to have some issues his second and third year. He started to bother some of the women on campus. He used to send them some instant messaging text pages, which they complained about, and the police ended up talking to Cho from time to time. He brought a camera into class and was taking inappropriate pictures of people. So these things started to happen. His suite mates from time to time, because he did live, when this happened, he did live in dormitory housing. And his suite mates started noticing things from time to time. In fact, after the police visited him one time, he sent an instant message to his roommate and said, "I might as well kill myself now." When he did that, the roommate called the police again, and the police came back, and he got referred again. And you'll see when we go through some of the findings from the panel here that although he was referred to the mental health community and to the administrators a number of times, in many cases the dots just didn't get connected. And that's what some of the findings of the panel was, that those are some of the things that need to be improved. So in any case, he had gone out and bought a .22 caliber handgun and lots of ammunition. He also went out and bought a 9mm handgun and lots of ammunition for that. He went to target practice quite a bit, and apparently he was also filming these videos He rented a hotel room at one point and did some of the videoing there. He rented some sort of panel van and did some of the videoing in the panel van. He bought them legally. He bought one through a gun shop and one online. And he filled out the appropriate paperwork. And you know, one thing that's unique about the U.S. is that although there are federal statutes that deal with gun possession and gun ownership, there are also state laws that in many cases vary from state to state. When he filled out the form 4473, which is the form you have to fill out, and there's a question on there about mental capacity. And when he filled it out, the mechanisms that were in place did not provide an investigation of that. When you know, if he answered no, there was no way to investigate that. And again, that's one of the items that needs to be addressed. But let me just talk a little bit about what happened this day. Because he woke up at about 5 o'clock that morning. And it's interesting because we talked about the woman at Maxim's the other day that sat there and had a meal, paid for the meal, and told the driver to go outside, and then she activated the IED. Well, he got up that morning and he knew exactly what he was going to do. He got dressed, and when his roommate saw him, he was putting acne cream on his face, on blemishes on his face. So here he was, he knew he was probably going to kill other people and kill himself that day, but he was still trying to clear up his acne. So it's just, I mention that only because it's kind of strange thinking about the mindset of people that are going to take these actions. In any event, the first thing that he did, his residence is not on here, but it's in the area of Johnston Hall. He walked to Johnston Hall, and his mail slot was in Johnston Hall. That's not where he lived. His mail slot was there. So that's why he had access to the building. Walked in Johnston Hall. A young lady got dropped off by her boyfriend, which typically she did every weekend. Now, it's not clear to me whether or not he was stalking her specifically, and I'm not sure that it's clear in the report either. But he got to her room up on the second floor and killed her in her room. And when the noise of the gun going off, the RA from next door came over to see what was going on, and he killed him. So now what we had was, you know, somebody dropped off the girlfriend went to her room, he killed her, he killed the person that responded, and he left. And at that point, nobody else saw anything, nobody saw him, until eventually somebody came to hook up with the girl that was killed to go to class, and eventually it was determined that the two people had been killed. In fact, I think somebody actually did call the police because they thought somebody fell out of their bunk. And so the police were responding, and they said from time to time they had people that fell out of their bunk. And so anyway, the police ended up showing up and started to investigate this as a dual homicide. But nobody had any descriptions of anybody, nothing other than the fact that the girl's boyfriend, everybody knew that he dropped her off that day. Apparently, they said that he used guns quite often. So immediately, he became a suspect. Now they started looking for his car, and this is a critical component, I think, of this whole thing, because him becoming a suspect, they're looking for his car. He was on his way to Radford, which was another college, and so now they're looking for him driving to Radford College, as opposed to being concerned about the fact that there might be a gunman on the campus. After he shoots those two, he goes back to his dormitory, gets on his computer, erases a bunch of things on his computer, and apparently takes off his blood-stained clothes, takes his videotape that he had made before, walks to the post office, mails this videotape to NBC News, and then finally makes his way over to Norris Hall. Now the time of this shooting was roughly 6:47, a little bit before 7 o'clock. He gets to Norris Hall. The shooting there started, I believe it was about 9:15. So there was about 2 hours difference between this shooting and this shooting. So he shows up at Norris Hall. You know, the fact that you have these peaks and valleys of population on campuses. Well, the first class at Tech had started at 8 o'clock, ended at 9. And my understanding is the next class started at 9:15. And so the class had just started when he made his way up to the second floor of Norris Hall. And with his two guns, just started walking into rooms, room 205, room 206, room 210, room 211, and just started shooting people, just indiscriminately killing people. One of the victims, 76-year-old gentleman, professor by the name of Liviu Labrescu, Romanian. First thing he did when he heard the shooting was he went over to the door and held the door shut. And as the shooter's shooting through the door, he's telling his students to escape through the windows. And every one of the students, except for one, was able to escape. Remember, it was on the second floor, because a 76-year-old man who lived through the Holocaust was holding the door shut. I think, you know, people who are intent on harming others are simply finding soft targets. You know, targets where, you know, you have these wonderful freedoms that we all enjoy on university and college campuses. It's a phenomena that, as I said, it hasn't existed for all time. The first one of real significance wasn't until 1966, but we continue to see from time to time people who want to take advantage of vulnerabilities or what they view as vulnerabilities. So in terms of the shooting, now the police, who again were investigating the first shooting, were getting reinforcements from both the Blacksburg Police Department as well as the Virginia State Police. And it actually took a couple of hours for notifications to be given to students that these shootings were taking place. And there are several different stages of notifications that ultimately got out. But there were some recommendations that those communications probably could have been better. In any case, the police response to the second building once the shooting started was pretty prompt, because there were already a lot more police on the campus at that point. And when they got to the building, Chow had already chained shut 3 of the doors on the building. And kind of interestingly, somebody who was interviewed after the fact said that a couple days before this incident, some of the doors had been chained shut, reported that they were chained shut, and that they saw somebody with a hood on. So theoretically, that could have been Chow, you know, testing his plan. And that never got reported to the police before the shooting itself. So Chow, when the police finally got to a 4th door, which was locked but wasn't chained, the police used a shotgun and breached the door and were able to get inside. When he heard that shotgun, he took his own life. And you can imagine the horror that campus went through for the next minutes, hours, days, and weeks after that, dealing with these issues. Some important points here from the review that the governor put together. He did exhibit signs of mental health during his childhood. We know that now. He did have a number of incidents at Virginia Tech, but once again, nobody connected the dots. Oftentimes, people did not share the information they needed to share because they thought they had a prohibition against it. In some cases, the university failed to provide necessary support and services to Cho. He had been identified time and again by professors and teachers. He was causing problems in classes. So there were a number of issues that probably should have been identified. Again, number of gaps in the mental health system identified. There was a lot of confusion regarding the federal and state laws regarding privacy with respect to mental health records. He should have been ineligible to purchase the guns because he had been judged to be a danger to himself, but the reality is the system didn't work. NICS is the National Instant Criminal Background Check System. It's a system that people get checked in. It's run by the FBI, and they get checked against when they go to purchase a firearm. But it was not clearly put in the system. Again, it wasn't, it was just kind of a flaw in the system, if you will. This whole issue about firearms on campus, there's a lot of uncertainty about how to do that or what the appropriate policies are. We talked about the police response to the residence hall, that it was well coordinated, and the response to the classes themselves was much quicker because they were already there. It was a mistake to identify this boyfriend who dropped off his girlfriend, that there's nothing wrong with considering him a person of interest, but perhaps too much attention was put into the fact that he was on his way, and potentially he could have been somebody that was still on the campus. It's still somewhat unclear exactly what his motives are, in spite of the fact that he released this fairly extensive diatribe in writings and in video. And I have to tell you, it was somewhat unnerving to see that 2 days later, on the 18th of April, is when NBC released it. And pretty much when they first got it, they were airing it on TV in its entirety. And there was such a response from the public that it was too early for them to be airing all these kind of crazy things that he was saying after this event had just taken place 2 days previously. The emergency medical care, again, anytime you have, in this case, 33 people killed and so many injured, you can imagine the difficulty in dealing with the medical situation. But overall, they felt that it was effective and timely. Certainly communications could be better. There was a lot of criticism about the medical examiner and how quickly they made notifications and how they handled the issues with the families. The state system to deploy professionals broke down somewhat. Again, you have to consider the totality of circumstances here. And the family assistance program at the university obviously could have been greatly improved as well. And certainly Virginia universities working together is important. At the same time that the governor had put together this review to look at the specific circumstances of the case and what worked and what didn't, the president put together a group from Health and Human Services, the Department of Education, and the Department of Justice. And just in general, they looked at this incident and came up with really some very general observations about information sharing. I think we've talked at length, and you're aware based on the jobs that you have, that information sharing is the most critical component of any crisis. This issue of firearms possession is something that will continue to be debated probably forever. Improved awareness and communication are the key to prevention. People with mental illness needs, if they have requirements, they should be able to get it. And finally, where we know what to do, we have to do it better. That just has to do with the implementation of things. A couple weeks ago, I had a chance to go up to the University of Pennsylvania, and I met up there with Maureen Rush, who is the Director of Public Safety, same position that Mika has here. And she's got a difficult job because, of course, she's got a university in the middle of Philadelphia, and it's a major and distinguished school. And she's got to deal with a lot of issues, a lot of same sort of issues that any college or university has, but again, because she's in a center city location. But we talked about a number of things, and I asked her, from her perspective, what are some of the most important things? And she talked about the crisis management plan to make sure that there's a procedure to follow, the fact that it has to be fluid and updated regularly. She, talked about incorporating all the stakeholders, not just the security people. Talked about emergency notification systems. By the way, at Virginia Tech, they were in the process of putting a siren system in on that campus. And there were some announcements made over a public address system, but obviously they didn't have an elaborate system that's being put in on a lot of campuses today to make emergency notifications. But also things like voicemail and text messaging and email systems. To get the word out to students, to get the word out. A lot of these systems are even notifying parents of situations that are taking place across the country with their students. A lot of them are incorporating automated decision-making processes. In other words, if there's an event that takes place, you don't have to wait for a person behind the console to make a notification. These things are done automatically in terms of notifying the administration policy group that's going to meet, or to notify the fire department or the police department. Many of these things are just done on an automated system. Emergency response drills and training obviously is critical to any of these things, and I think every college and university across America, and I'm sure throughout the world, hopefully is planning some of these things. Obviously there's different levels, as David talked about earlier, and technologies. Whether it's CCTV or duress alarms or blue lights or any of those sorts of things. When I read through the timeline of what happened at Virginia Tech and kind of living through it, because it was kind of like the sniper shootings in Washington, D.C. when these things are happening. We've talked an awful lot in the last 2 weeks about terrorism and IEDs, and certainly we may see some IEDs, we may see some VBIDs in the U.S. at some point in time. We certainly need to be prepared for that. But in the meantime, we have tragedies like this where 32 lives were taken unnecessarily. And so at the same time where we're preparing for one thing, we need to be prepared for things like this on colleges and campuses. And so the reason that I asked you to take a long look at these photos of the students that were killed is because, you know, those of us that are professional security folks, this is why we come to work early and stay late every day, to protect people and to protect property. And I can't think of a better cause, a better avocation than doing the work that each of you do.